Turn that down. Twitch works. YouTube work. There we go. All right. Join us for episode 130 of the Ego Chall Podcast, breaking down everything from our ROSTERMANIA so far and talking a little about Black Ops 6 beta. Twitch. Oh, that's YouTube. Oh, that's not right. Which was right. I'm just copying too fast. All right. Cool.
All right, you ready to get started?
Yes, sir.
Hello and welcome to episode 130 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have quite a bit to talk about. Some ROSTERMANIA stuff, some teams leaving the CDL or A team, and potentially more. And as well, we have the Black Ops 6 beta. Before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. Happy Labor Day to those in the U.S. and hope everyone had a good weekend and been doing well since last time we had a show. But literally the day after we went live, I was just looking at the dates before we started here. We last went live on August 18th because that was the end of the Esports World Cup, and August 19th was when all the ROSTERMANIA stuff started happening. So pretty much par for the course for how things usually go for us, but that just means we got a bunch to talk about today, so I'm ready to hop right in.
Yeah, I think I texted you the day after when everything started dropping. I was like, how does this keep happening? So but that's, like you said, par for the course. That's something that we have expected for years at this point, that the day, maybe 2 days afterward, we're always going to get inundated with information that we definitely could have used to talk about a podcast, but that's just how life goes. And the big news, I would say the biggest news, is that Team Falcons, the one of the non-CDL teams that participated in that Esports World Cup, which was happening in Saudi Arabia, that team is joining the Call of Duty League starting this upcoming season, and they will be replacing the Las Vegas Legion. So I think first of all, we have to start with the Legion, which was a founding member of the Call of Duty League, is no more. Originally the Paris Legion for, I believe, 3 seasons, and then the Las Vegas Legion for the last 2. Undoubtedly one of the worst and least competitive teams in CDL history. I think that can't really be argued. They own the worst season in CDL history. I think they won 5 matches that entire year. The last season that they were in Paris. And then they came to Vegas. They were more competitive and nearly made the playoffs. But, ultimately a failed, if you're just looking at the results on, in the server, in the lobby or whatever, definitely a failure from that respect. And did not become one of the more popular teams either. So I would not say I'm happy to see anyone go in general, but they were on the whole not competitive, and they were not really trying to compete all that much either in terms of salary. And, we've talked at length about how little that they had seemed to kind of invest into their operation. But, for the behind the scenes people, the people that don't have much control over that and are just trying to do their job. And of course the players who are now kind of, on the outside looking in, I feel for them. But as far as the ownership, I'm kind of happy to see the Legion and their ownership group go. And in their place, we get Falcons, which is kind of it's more complicated than, probably we can get into on one single episode, but it certainly brings in something that is quite obvious in sports, and that's Saudi Arabia's investment, and something that we had actually, the fact that the Esports World Cup was in Saudi Arabia. And it was, obviously a big deal. It was just a little bit less than the Call of Duty League Championship prize pool. So obviously the money is there. I don't think investment in terms of actual money will be too much of an issue with Falcons. But I would love to get your thoughts on all of this. The Legion going out, the Falcons coming in, and they're bringing with them a roster that they've already kind of set out for.
Yeah, I mean, first things first, and any longtime listeners of the Ego Chall Podcast know about the long-running meme that had some seriousness to it, but not necessarily full seriousness. But the Paris is winning champs and the Vegas is winning champs. At least from a Legion perspective, is that bandwagon is officially dead. I guess the Vegas isn't because they are the Vegas Falcons now, but at least in terms of the Legion is winning champs, that bandwagon, that ship has sailed. So rest in peace to just that, meme and joke. But on a more serious note, like you kind of said, I do think for the sake of the competitiveness of the CDL and just the future of the league, the having no longer having the Legion franchise in the league should be better in the long term in terms of, theoretically having an organization now like Falcons that has shown a willingness to spend money on high level talent and try to compete immediately in some other esports. Now, it doesn't that's not what they're doing in this instance for the CDL. We'll get into that in a little bit. But at least in terms of, you know, based on what has happened with the Falcons organization and other esports and stuff, I can say pretty safely that they've probably in the much shorter period invested more in there's rumors basically. I don't think it's actually been confirmed, but like Nico, obviously you and I know, I don't know a ton about Counter-Strike, but I know Nico is like a really good Counter-Strike player for CS2 and CS Counter-Strike, and or good Counter-Strike player for G2. That's what my head's all messed up.
But CS2 as well.
And yes, but there's like rumors going around that there's like a $2 million buyout that Falcons is trying to pay to acquire him for their Counter-Strike team. And like whether that actually happens or not is one thing. I know there were reports a while ago about them trying to get Nico and he stayed on G2, but now it might actually happen. Just the thought of like Paris Legion / Vegas Legion trying to spend $2 million on a roster, let alone one player, that's not even like close to comparable. So like that should illustrate at least like what the Falcons as an organization are willing to do in other esports and could be willing to do in the future in the CDL. Like you said, there are other multiple facets and angles and stuff to talk about with just the whole Saudi Arabia situation and whatnot. But with them entering the league here, they're coming in with an all Saudi roster, the roster that we saw at the Esports World Cup. So it is not an instance of them coming in and throwing a ton of money, but there's already been comments from like the community responding to that and giving their thoughts. And the coach of the team, I think his name is like Lou T or something like that. I don't really know how to say it, has already like responded and said like this team has been working together and they want to give him an opportunity. So hey, if they're entering the league, paying money to acquire the franchise slot, and that's what they want to do, like it's who are we to say they can't do that? And they're the ones putting up the money. So we'll have to see how it goes. The other end of that coin though is that we have Miami Heretics, which is presumably going to remain an all Spanish team, and Falcons being an all Saudi team. That in theory takes away two potential teams that free agents and challengers players could make their way onto. At least in terms of starting spots. Then you factor in teams like Optic and FaZe, who we are not expecting to make changes. So literally a third of the league, if there is no expansion, is most likely not making changes. So yeah, there are multiple ramifications from just this single organizational shift. But um, the other thing I was going to try and mention is you were just talking very briefly on Vegas and their tenure in the CDL, and I actually just wrote the article when this acquisition was confirmed, and the season you were referring to, the last one for Paris is when they went 2-23. It wasn't 5 wins; they only won 2 series the whole season. And I remember we were talking about Boston and comparing it to, like, is Boston this year the worst team? And then we kind of hit us that actually no, Paris had only won 2 whole series the whole year. So that was the last Paris season, and then after that, Vegas Legion the last 2 years in 22, 23, and 24 came in ninth place in both years, which means that the only season that the Paris/Vegas Legion made it to champs was in the inaugural CDL season when every single franchise made it. They never qualified when it was only 8 teams out of 12. So I think that further goes to illustrate just the lack of success that was seen from this franchise. Then you add on top what you were mentioning about all the reports of them seemingly not being willing to spend a ton of money on player salaries and whatnot, trying to, skate by seemingly and do the bare minimum. At least that's how it felt from the outside looking in. And that gets us to where we are today with them exiting the CDL. And now we have seemingly a team who, although, like I said, they might not be spending a ton of money here on high profile players who are well known in the CDL, but they are coming in Falcons and trying to make a name for themselves with these guys, and we're just gonna have to see how it all plays out. So a lot of ramifications from just this one move. Could be more, kind of like you teased just a couple minutes ago. But this was, yeah, like you said, this was a bang to start off ROSTERMANIA, literally a day after the Esports World Cup. And I will say, too, we did see this Falcons team play at the Esports World Cup, and they lost 3-0 to Atlanta FaZe, which we had mentioned on that recap show. It was the hard point in particular was a lot closer than I would have expected. But outside of that, it wasn't the most competitive series. And then they lost 3-2 to Lore Gaming, which was the Challengers Champs team from NA, led by Arcides. So we have a team entering the CDL that lost to a Challengers team, and seemingly those Challengers players who beat them might not, at least right now, there's no real rumblings of them getting a shot to enter the league. So I think that's where a lot of people are like having very low expectations for this Falcons roster in its first year in the CDL. But at the same time, you look at, last year with LAG, a lot of people were very skeptical of that coaching staff and that roster. It went better than a lot of people expected for them. I would say the same for Miami. Both those teams qualify for champs when Legion didn't, outside of the first year when everybody made it in the CDL. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. But yeah, this was definitely a banger just to kick things off in ROSTERMANIA.
Like you, I'm interested to see what Falcons ends up doing, because obviously, like you said, they announced this all Saudi roster, and we did get to see them in action in the Esports World Cup. They, gave FaZe a run for their money, but at the end of the day, like, I don't think many people are expecting them to be super competitive, like you were kind of indicating, and I'm fine with this kind of thing. Like I had talked about it, and we've talked about it at length, that when Paris, the Legion, they came into the CDL, that you either have to be competitive or you have to kind of create some kind of fandom among your city.
Yeah.
And they could have went with a French roster or a French speaking roster, and it would have worked out.
French phenom.
Yeah. And it probably would have worked out a lot better for them, at least in terms of like getting fans to support you. And really the only fans that were supporting Vegas over the last few years are Clayster's fans or Attach's fans. Like, that's really what they had going for them. They had these big players, at least stateside, that, they have people that actually care about them. They want to see them win. But other than that, they just didn't connect with people, and that is a big sticking point. I'm interested to see how that works with Falcons, how they end up connecting with the Saudi audience, or if there is a Saudi audience to connect with on like a great scale. Obviously, Saudi involvement in sports and esports more recently has become like a big talking point. I'm not sure of like the funding, and obviously, like you were alluding to, Falcons has been like really, at least reportedly, trying to invest heavily into, you know, someone like Nico, who is one of the best Counter-Strike players in the world. And I think I know they had Simple on loan at one point. And they also have a really talented Counter-Strike roster, a lot of big names from Denmark, like Dupree, Zonic is the coach, Magisk. Like, they have like a really big name roster. I'm curious to see if that ends up being the case in Call of Duty. They 100% can do it if they want to. If the plan, or if they have the ability to pay a bunch of money, they will get big name players. That will not be a problem whatsoever, because there's not going to be, you know, there's going to be a few players that are like, no, I'd rather stay with Optic, I'd rather stay with FaZe, blah, blah, blah. But like for the most part, most of these players, if they're offered enough money, will join Falcons and create a super team. That could be the case. I'm sure if they want to, they could do it this season, especially if, you know, we'll talk about it later, but Toronto, quite a few of their players might be free agents. You know, we'll talk about it, but SIB from Cloud9, free agent. And that kind of leads to the ability for them, at least, to create a competitive big name roster. But we'll have to see how this works out, if they're going to commit to just, you know, completely going with the Saudi roster. I'm fine with that on like the surface, but it also depends on if they're actually going to be competitive, because we saw it with Miami. They looked good at times and looked really bad at times. And, you know, if Falcons is going to be a decent middle of the road team, I'm completely A-okay with just trying to connect with your home base and saying, this is our team. We're a Saudi team. We're going to stick to that. But if you're really bad, if they're at the very bottom, then you kind of have to scrap that at some point, you know, or you're just going to turn into, you know, an extension of the Legion, where you're not competitive and you're just kind of hogging up a space in this league that is supposed to be at the very top of Call of Duty Esports. But of course, we're going to have to give them a little bit of time to kind of prove that and see what's happening. But, you know, I think we can probably put a pin in that. Rest in peace, the Legion. Not particularly sad to see you go. A lot of what ifs, a lot of really missed opportunities, I feel, on their end. And now we move into this era with Falcons as part of the CDL. And they might not be one of the, you know, might not be the only team to join the CDL this offseason. Reports of big esports organizations like Genji, who of course were heavily involved in Call of Duty Esports in the CWL era. I believe Black Ops 4 with, you know, Havoc and that crew. They were one of the best teams that year, and certainly would, you know, be open to having them back in the CDL, or into Call of Duty Esports in the CDL era. And then Fnatic, who has not really been involved in Call of Duty, maybe aside from like a moment or two. I can't really remember. They were kind of like G2 in that respect, where G2 was like in and out of Call of Duty Esports for a long time. And I think Fnatic may have been involved at some point, but I don't remember a specific roster.
Had a team with Tommy and the Twins.
Oh yeah, they did. Yeah. That was IW. So that was probably the only season that they actually competed. And of course they were pretty good, and we kind of got introduced to Scraps and Weskin from that, but not much else from Fnatic. And those two teams in particular have been linked to replacing the Los Angeles Guerrillas, who we've talked about at length now, about how, you know, what's going on with them, just being really up in the air about their organization. And then the Carolina Royal Ravens, which has had a, you know, financial issues reportedly on the back end with their parent organization, and which recently moved from London to Carolina. And we don't have a European team as a result of that. Fnatic, I believe, is based in London, and they probably in hindsight would have been a better team to kind of be based in England than Carolina or than the Royal Ravens, but that's here nor there. Your thoughts on this report that Gen G and Fnatic could eventually make their way to the CDL?
Yeah, big names like you said would be definitely, especially in case of LAG. We've talked at length now about the turmoil seemingly behind the scenes with LAG. So, kind of similar feeling with the Legion in the sense of like if LAG doesn't want to be involved anymore, these other orgs that are popular in esports want to be involved. Let's give them a shot, see what they can do. I do the most interesting aspect, and I will just wrap in. So that initial report, or whatever you want to consider it, a rumor leak, came from the Ghost of Hope on Twitter, who is mostly known as a leaker in terms of like general game stuff in COD, not necessarily esports stuff. And where was it? Oh, here it is. So one of the comments on this initial tweet was Hope CDL Insider what? Kind of like surprised that this person Hope was saying CDL stuff, and they responded by saying, "I heard things every season, TBH. I just don't report on them." So you can take this for what you will. I actually didn't see this part, but I was gonna loop it in too. So I'll get to this in a second. But the other set of teams potentially mentioned by the rotation was Team Liquid and Space Station Gaming. This was mentioned by the rotation in a quote tweet of this Fnatic and Gen G report. And what I was thinking was, because I didn't even remember reading this when this tweet initially broke on August 21st, was them saying that these orgs are potentially looking to replace Carolina and Gorillas. The first thing that came to mind for me was, okay, where's that leave Boston? Because at this point we had already heard the reports of Boston potentially looking to exit the CDL, reportedly laying off staff, etc. And the Ghost of Hope leaker also said sources indicate that Boston Breach will be running it back despite poor results and unstable financial backing. So that's potentially a interesting wrinkle or development in the Boston Breach camp and situation there. Just we haven't heard anything else outside of this since that initial report. I believe was from August 7th, earlier last month. So yeah, I think that's the thing that stands out to me the most is that these orgs, I guess LAG definitely isn't a surprise to either of us. If you told me two teams after the Vegas Legion and Falcons deal gets done, if you told me two teams are leaving the CDL, the two names that probably would come to mind first for me would be LAG and then Boston because of the report previously on Boston. So I guess Carolina is a little slightly more surprising. But you mentioned there's stuff going on behind the scenes with organizational backing and whatnot with Rect Global or whatever it was initially for their parent company. That whole thing still confuses me, and I get it mixed up with the LEC for teams for League of Legends. But nonetheless, I'm rambling. I think we get some of these more popular teams from across esports, and in bigger esports, it's can only really be a good thing for the CDL, and in terms of getting more eyeballs on it. If, like you mentioned, the organizations come in and are willing to try to be competitive at first. If they're coming in and just trying to do what these teams they're replacing have done, then it's no different than those teams staying in, right? So that's the twist on it at the end of the day. Nothing has been confirmed on this front. Sent these initial potential team reports came out August 21st. We're now September 2nd at the time of filming this, and we haven't heard anything else or any developments on this front, so we'll have to stay tuned for more. But that could also throw a wrinkle into ROSTERMANIA in terms of we haven't really had a ton of signings yet. We've heard a lot of players being declared free agents or being released from their teams. So who knows? Maybe we're gonna have to wait a little bit for some of these organizations to be settled first, and then we'll start seeing players get signed. So a whole lot of stuff going on in the early days of ROSTERMANIA, that's for sure.
The thing that, or the theme that I've been seeing with these organizations and the specific organizations that are leaving, most of them seem to be the non-endemic esports brands. So LAG was a Kronk Sports Entertainment. They're a traditional sports thing, entity, and they come into esports. They try to create the Guard. They try to create LAG, blah, blah, blah. The Gladiators as well, I believe, in the Overwatch League. And then they see that the money that they probably thought was promised, I'm sure it was promised by Activision Blizzard at some point, if you invest, you're going to be on the ground floor of this future billion-dollar industry or whatever. And they were sold a bill of goods that they can't really collect on because there's just not that much money in esports, or to the degree that it makes it worthwhile for a lot of these people. But something like LAG, they're like, all right, this is done. Like, we're not making our money. Let's get out. Boston Breach, it looks like could be of the same kind of thing. They are right now up in the air. Like, I don't know how you would even like that. That seems ridiculous to me, by the way, that they're going to run it back despite unstable financial backing. Like, the results thing is whatever. Unstable financial backing, isn't that the whole reason that we have franchising in the first place? What is the point of having franchising and limiting the number of teams that can be involved in this if there's unstable financial backing of one of 12 teams? That makes no sense. And that's something on Activision Blizzard or Microsoft's end, I guess now, that they shouldn't allow that. And I understand there is a fan base for Boston. People do support them. They're one of the only Northeast teams, and obviously Boston is a great sports town, has a lot of history, and if, in theory, the Boston Breach is owned by Oxygen Esports, which is, I think, funded by Robert Kraft and his operation, so he's a billionaire, so there should be stable financial backing, but if this report by Hope is true, and that there is unstable financial backing, then Microsoft, Activision Blizzard, whoever's running the CDL, should step in and say, we need proof that you're going to be okay financially, like that you're going to be able to pay your players, pay your staff, that you're going to be able to get through a season or two. And there's no reason for Microsoft not to do that, and try to make sure that this is stable, and that if you guys can't do it, then let's get someone else in here that can support a team and will be able to go forward with this next season. And maybe we will see them, potentially pull out. There's no, real hard indication that they're going to stick, because a lot of this is, I'm sure, very fluid with the layoff stuff started less than a month ago. The reports are about a month ago, and we don't really know what's going to happen. But I find that ridiculous by itself. But then with the actual teams that could come in, I'm excited, hopeful, I guess, is probably a better word, because you do have Genji, who's, it's a newer operation than something like Liquid or Fnatic, where they've been around for so long, been involved with esports for well over a decade. Like, there's really no question a lot of times with, maybe not the financial backing, but just kind of the reputation is a lot stronger. But Genji has a relatively strong reputation. They've been involved in the Overwatch League, League of Legends, all of that. So I don't really have a lot of questions about that, but it is interesting that we're seeing these non-endemic brands leave, and ultimately we might be left with FaZe, Optic, Cloud9, 100 Thieves, maybe Liquid, Fnatic, Genji, like the teams that we already had before, or the teams that have been just like they're esports teams. They're not these sports teams trying to become esports adjacent. I think that's pretty interesting that it's happening like this. But yeah, I hope it just brings some kind of stability. And I know we've been talking about that for a while, but there just has to be at some point some stability, or, you know, even if it's cutting back on these salaries and, okay, we can't pay this guy $500,000 a year because we're not getting a return on investment. I think that's fine. But at some point we have to look ourselves in the mirror and be like, you know, and say that maybe this isn't worth it. And, you know, I really just don't have a lot of sympathy for billionaires. Obviously, I've said that multiple times because it keeps happening. It keeps happening that these teams that are supposedly run by billionaires, they simply can't afford to pay their people anymore, which just seems ridiculous and ludicrous. But yeah, I'm happy if it turns out to be that these big esports brands, and Space Station is part of that as well. I shouldn't leave them out. I think any team that is involved currently in the Halo esports scene, like at the top level, I think they have like 16 teams. I think any of those teams, they probably should be on the radar for the CDL, which I think is Quadrant is in that. Optic is obviously involved. I think FaZe is involved as well. So like there are a lot of like crossovers, and especially if Microsoft owns Activision Blizzard, and there is that connection, I would assume that any team that is currently invested in Halo could be a potential investor in Call of Duty as well, at least, you know, in the near future. But we'll see, I guess. That's a lot of this podcast, because a lot of it is not confirmed. A lot of it is just, you know, kind of speculating on what could be at some point, including these rosters. I think in terms of that might be the organizational stuff that we just talked about. But in terms of rosters, I think there's a lot that is happening and will happen over the next few weeks. Hopefully not a day after we get this podcast out, because that would be really annoying. But I think the biggest news in terms of roster front, potential news, I guess, because this is a report by CDL Scrim Intel. So they reported that every one of the Toronto Ultra are restricted free agents. Of course, we talked about, I specifically said that the Ultra were potentially like the domino to fall, that they were a wild card, so to speak. And if they made a move, then we could see a few other big name teams and, you know, the rest of the league making moves as a result of this. But Scrim Intel says all of Ultra are restricted free agents. Now, remember, this doesn't mean they all leave. Similar happened last season. And we have seen restricted free agents just means, hey, look for options. You are still under contract. We could bring you back if we want to. And, you know, anybody that wants to have you will have to pay us a buyout or, you know, negotiate with us at some point to get you on their team. So again, that's a good disclaimer that just because you're a restricted free agent does not mean that you will leave your team. But your thoughts on this potential shakeup and the domino effect it could have, you know, especially with Scrappy, obviously, is the top name. That's the superstar, one of the best players in the league. Any team would be happy to have him. But then there's Insight, there's Kleenex, there's Envoy. All of these players are very valuable and will almost certainly be on a CDL roster next year. But what do you think about this potential happening with Toronto?
You took the words out of my mouth. Just in passing, kind of, when you mentioned this happened last year, that's immediately where my head went with this. Obviously, again, this isn't confirmed or anything, but and I don't even think Kleenex in particular said anything last year, and maybe he did. I don't remember in particular how it went down last year on the Toronto front, but I definitely do remember it being a talking point of like Kleenex potentially being on the move last year, and kind of the same restricted free agent set, and, you know, just that situation. Then of course he ends up re-signing with Toronto. So that's where my head's at right now, at least. Like, you know, even if all of these guys are restricted free agents, it's possible that multiple of them will be representing Toronto again in the 2025 season. I do think it is interesting. As far as I know, the last time I checked Twitter, if this is true that they are all restricted free agents on Toronto, the only one who has publicly said it is Insight, which makes me think that is if anybody is definitely on the move or potentially on the move, Insight is the most likely candidate because and he's come out publicly and said it, so he's definitely weighing his options. Obviously, like you mentioned, Scrap is going to be highly coveted if he is made available. Um, at the same time, he is going to have a very big price tag on him. Obviously, I've never seen his contract, but I would assume he has a very large buyout attached to his name. So any team that would want to get Scrappy, as long as he is a restricted free agent, they would presumably have to pay a very large sum to acquire him. And as we saw, I believe we mentioned it last time, or just somewhat recently, we talked about Pred and Seattle and Optic situation where Seattle had the opportunity to get a buyout from Optic for Pred. They chose not to, and then in free agency, Pred just walks and joins Optic for free. The same thing could happen here with Scrappy. If he's a restricted free agent this year, he could just stay with Toronto if Toronto doesn't want to take a buyout, and then he would presumably be an unrestricted free agent next offseason, and he would get to walk for free. And then, presumably, if an organization isn't paying a very large buyout, he could potentially even make more money in terms of his salary and contract wise, because then a team isn't having to, fork over six figures sum for a buyout. They can put more money into his contract offer, and there could be a bidding war for him. That would be kind of crazy, and definitely interesting and all that. But that's obviously, most likely a year in advance. So don't have to focus on that right now. But yeah, the big thing with this restricted free agent label, whatever you want to call it, is that end of the day, Toronto's going to have an opportunity to bring back these current players who are restricted free agents. So it's not, necessarily Toronto Ultra completely blowing it up and having a different roster next year. It's very possible that some of these guys, and multiple of them, will compete in the purple jersey next year. But again, like you said, for most of this stuff, it's going to be a wait and see. It does sound like C9 is interested in Scrap, and that fit kind of ties in with SIB announcing he is a restricted free agent. I thought that was a little interesting because Jack had said, C9 Jack, the CEO owner of Jack, said they were re-signing all of the New York Subliners players after C9 acquired the New York CDL slot, and now potentially SIB might be on the move. I mean, if they are able to get someone like Scrap and Hydra is a very scary duo. That would definitely be a headline move in ROSTERMANIA, and C9 is no stranger to forking over large sums for players in other esports. The name that immediately comes to mind for me is Perks and League of Legends. They spent, if I remember the reports at the time, it was definitely over $4 million. Sword Art, the TSM was a $6 million contract, so I think Perks was lower than that. I can't remember. Maybe it was $5 million for Perks. Regardless, it was a multi-million-dollar contract given for C9 to acquire Perks from G2. So, Jack likes to win. For those not in tune to the League of Legends space, C9 was upset this past weekend in the LCS by 100 Thieves, and they will not be going to League of Legends World Championship this year, which was a pretty massive upset, and a lot of people were expecting C9 to not only compete for the LCS title this summer, but be one of the representatives for North America at Worlds. So there could be big changes coming to the C9 League of Legends roster. How much will that impact what C9 is willing to do on the COD front, that's all up in the air. But I know C9 and Jack, they like to win, they like to hoist trophies, and if they are able to, you know, I don't think financial responsibility is the right word I'm looking for here, but if they're like reasonably able to acquire Scrappy without, putting the entire organization at risk, I think Jack's gonna do everything he can to try and make that happen. So that'd be a big domino to fall, and it will be interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah. For people not in tune with League of Legends, or obviously a lot of the other esports that C9 is involved with, Jack and Liquid Steve, and obviously TSM is not in the LCS anymore, but Reggie is, those guys really stake like a lot of their reputation on being competitive, and like they spend a lot of money typically to try to get to that level to compete. I would expect that to be pretty similar in Cloud9 or in Call of Duty. Obviously, I don't think anybody is going to get a $4 or $5 million deal, like at least in CDL. But maybe if Simp was on the open market, maybe he could create a bidding war. Hydra, maybe he creates a bidding war. But I do think it is interesting that Cloud9 might be able to, in theory, offset some of this buyout cost if they were to try to get Scrappy by selling SIB's contract as well at the same time, because that wasn't something that Seattle really had, or Optic. Obviously, Optic is just financially like in a better place because they're so popular. They can kind of generate a lot better revenue. But with Seattle, they made the mistake of not selling when they did. But Toronto and C9, excuse me, I want to say New York, but I think they're technically C9 New York, but I don't think we're going to be calling them New York on a regular basis. But C9 and Toronto, they have an ability right now to generate revenue by selling their players. Toronto in a much better case because Scrappy is the big name. I don't think C9 is going to get rid of Hydra, but that would also be pretty crazy as well. But, C9 can, let's say for the sake of this argument, they sell SIB for $100,000. Like they get $100,000 and they let him go to whichever team that he ends up signing with. That's $100,000 that can go toward paying a buyout for Scrappy or whatever player that they would like to replace SIB with. So that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, Scrappy is going to be the biggest free agent if he is an actual free agent and not someone that, is just kind of lingering. Because like you said, Insight, he had announced that he was an RFA like weeks before it was like reported or rumored that all of Toronto are RFAs. But I also thought it was interesting that Scrim Intel, they had tweeted like 30 minutes after SIB announced that he's a restricted free agent, they just like say, C9's very in on Scrappy and they're going to try to do everything possible to sign him this offseason. I thought that was pretty interesting. But that's a lot of ifs, a lot of whats, a lot of buts. Like there's really no guarantee that any of this happens. And we've seen in the past, like with Toronto, RFAs do not mean actual free agents and that there will be movement. But Scrappy is potentially a free agent, and so is Envoy. Scrim Intel tweeted the day after all of that happened. He said sources, Envoy has held talks with both LAT and C9. So LAT is an interesting one because we've talked about it in the past, because they've talked about how, we want to be financially responsible and we want to be profitable. We want to make sure that this is not a losing money venture for us anymore. I don't know how that ends up working out if you are going to sign Envoy or buy out Envoy and get him onto your roster. Of course, LAT was surprisingly competitive this season. I think they finished fourth at Champs, third maybe. They were definitely one of the most competitive teams. They definitely got second at the Esports World Cup, which is great. And they beat Toronto in the first round of champs. I'm not quite sure, it's slipping my mind exactly where they finished, but they nearly beat Optic as well at champs, and were one of, I think, the top 4 teams just in general in terms of competition at the end of the season. So there's a lot of hope, a lot of optimism around that team. But I think you and I both agree that there does seem to be a ceiling, and that their ceiling is much lower in theory than Optic or FaZe or C9 or Toronto. Like, I think they could beat any of those teams on a given day, but I have a hard time believing that on a consistent basis that they could reach the heights that a lot of those rosters who have a ton of star power, that those teams could reach. Maybe you disagree, but I think in general, LAT was not expected to do much this past season, and they were a positive surprise in that respect. If they were to get Envoy, does that change much? Obviously, his stock is relatively low after this season. He of course was on LAT when they won the World Championship. He leaves after last season, as does everybody on that team, including Octane, who retired. And if he does go back to LAT and a year later, I don't know what that really does. Do you think adding Envoy to this LAT team, does that increase their chances of being like a world title contender this coming season?
No, I don't think either of these teams mentioned here by CDL Scrim in LAT or C9 really makes sense for Envoy if he is to leave Toronto. C9 just in particular, like it wouldn't make sense for me to, if you bring, unless they're making multiple changes, like if they bring in Envoy to replace SIB, that just doesn't make sense because then they have 3 subs and only Skies on an AR. And I mean, I guess they could get lucky and, based on the Black Ops 6 meta, one of the best guns in the game is a sub. So I guess maybe if they're thinking ahead here and thinking it's a 3 sub meta, like, yeah, maybe, but I don't think they're thinking about it like that. So I don't know if C9 makes a ton of sense. And then, like you said, that my head immediately went to the profitability talks we've had about 100 Thieves as an organization. The roster they've had most recently had some success at the end of this year. Most likely a lot of guys on lower salaries or close to the minimum, and bringing in Envoy would definitely be more costly, and just in terms of how much it physically costs to pay for him. So yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. The one thing that would potentially be a wrinkle in this development would be if Genji does get a spot. Envoy does have that previous relationship with Genji from when they first were in the CWL. He was a part of that Midnight Esports roster that got acquired by Genji, and he was the one they kind of stuck around, and then they built around him. So in a world where Genji does get a CDL spot, they maybe go to somebody they know, like Envoy, and they're like, hey, we're gonna try to get this guy and let him build a team around him. I do agree with you that his stock after this year is probably lower than it has been in previous years. Just he seemed to struggle at times this past year. But I do think that potential Genji scenario is one that makes a ton of sense to me if that does come to fruition. But again, that's banking on a lot of things there. Um, the other thing about this LAT thing is there was a clip I saw last night going around of Clay talking about his options, and he basically said he doesn't have any offers yet, and he was going down like team by team, breaking it down, and he's saying like Optic and FaZe aren't making any moves. He's not going to get an offer from the top 4. Seemingly throwing in Toronto and C9 there, and then he said, like, kind of just like going through, he was like, LA Thieves isn't making a change after the way they played the end of the year. Might have just been just an assumption on his part and might not necessarily be true, but that's worth keeping an eye on. And again, based on what we know about 100 Thieves as an organization and what they want to do financially, it wouldn't totally surprise me if they decided to go down that route and they keep this roster together and see what they're able to do with another year playing together at a seemingly a much lower cost than some of these other potential top rosters. Um, And even if they enter, LA Thieves enter this season with this same roster, we saw this last season with them. This was the first season right after they get rid of the world championship roster of Envoy, Kenny, Octane, and Draza, and that we hear these profitability stuff. And you and I were both kind of, I believe you were in agreement with me at the time, like we were kind of surprised of when they were making roster moves and stuff, or when they were struggling at the start of the year. We were like, oh, maybe they're just going to keep sticking it out and not be willing to spend money on other players. They made 2 roster moves this year, because they had Afro and Cammy at the start of the year, and they bring in Nasty and Kremp. So they were willing to spend money. Again, those moves likely didn't break the bank. They were still willing to spend more than $0 to improve the roster, as opposed to some other teams that might have just said they want to be profitable and stuck with their initial roster and not made any moves. So, in terms of Envoy, though, I don't, going back to LAT or going to C9 really don't make a ton of sense to me. I do think if Genji enters the league, that could be an interesting landing spot for him. But otherwise, yeah, a lot of question marks around his future and where he's at next year. But I do, kind of like you said when we were talking about Toronto, I expect all those Toronto guys to be on a CDL team in one way or the other.
Yeah, definitely. And with LAT, it's going to be intriguing to see how they manage their finances. Of course, they're a private company, so they don't have to necessarily release those figures. But if you're going to say that you want to be profitable or break even, then I know that there's going to be some pretty severe limitations at that point if you're going to stick true to that. At the same point, I do think that in general, 100 Thieves wants to be competitive and that they want to win. And those kind of play at odds a lot of times, because I'm sure if you asked or if you looked at the financials of the 12 CDL teams, I wouldn't be surprised if Vegas was one of the most, or I guess one of the, they didn't lose nearly as much money as a lot of other teams did. I'm sure that's the case, but at the same point, like, they were also not very competitive in general. And I think it was even Clayster might have said that at some point, that, if you looked at like the total like cost of the CDL, like Vegas or Paris, that they probably had lost the least amount of money of any of the CDL teams, because they just didn't spend much money. Like, they didn't put up their players in really nice fancy hotels. They didn't have a huge space that they dedicated their practice time to. They didn't have a ton of support staff. So, and of course we don't know what will happen with the head coaching position with 100 Thieves at this point, I think, because JCap is not the head coach anymore. We'll see what happens with that. Maybe Shane will just kind of bump up. I know he's been.
That's what it looks like at the Esports World Cup.
Yeah. So maybe it's just as simple as that. But when it comes to roster moves, and especially with the roster move, if they were to go for Envoy, he's under contract. That creates additional costs, and I'm not entirely sure how much benefit there would be, or added benefit over some of the team or some of the players that they have that construct their team at this current point. But we will see at some point during the offseason what 100 Thieves ends up doing. Then we just had a bunch of other stuff that happened. I think that's most of the big stuff that we kind of got to, and we're nearing an hour. So we're just going to kind of quickly move through some of these teams. I'm just going to start. If you want to look at all of the roster moves that have happened since the CDL championship ended, you can go to .esports.com. Bink has an article. It's just like a running list of all of the moves from each team that has made a move at some point. So we're just going to start at the very top, and I'm going to go down this article, starting with Carolina. And they've been pretty active in getting rid of their players. Of course, Clayster, he was released. We talked about that a few months ago before the Esports World Cup. Since then, Beans, TJ, and Fellow have all been released or are restricted or unrestricted free agent. So Fellow, he's an RFA, but TJ is an unrestricted free agent, and Beans was released as well. Your thoughts or your predictions? What, I guess, is it too hard to tell because they might not be a part of the CDL next season?
Correct. I do think it's interesting that Fellow is a restricted free agent versus TJ being unrestricted. So there is the potential that Fellow could run it back with Carolina if Carolina does exist and isn't a different organization. Most notably, though, out of those, the esports roster that you just mentioned, that's 3/4 of the team. The one not mentioned is Gwyn, Rookie of the Year. So he's still under contract, and makes a ton of sense. If Carolina is remaining in the CDL, they're going to want to keep him, build around him, seemingly, unless they get like a huge buyout offer. In a world where Carolina makes a move to exit the CDL and go to another organization, that organization, that's got to be one of the selling points of acquiring Carolina versus another potential spot like LAG or potentially Boston, right? Like you got the Rookie of the Year. That's a big bargaining chip. Could potentially, in theory, up the price of what the Carolina franchise is able to acquire for these in the bidding war between the organizations and whatnot. A good chip for any entering team to build their roster around the last Rookie of the Year. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that in terms of just entering and having somebody readily available like that. So that's the most interesting thing about me for Carolina is, and not really much of a surprise. We kind of both talked about it when we were going through our pre-ROSTERMANIA stuff in terms of what we thought some of these bottom teams needed to do. It was we were both saying, yeah, you got to build around Gwyn, and seemingly that's the route Carolina is going down as long as they are actually remaining in the league.
Minnesota Rocker Accuracy has been released, and Estriel, who joined for the Esports World Cup, he is an unrestricted free agent. So he was part of LAG for this season, and he was kind of impressive at points during the season. He joined for the Esports World Cup because LAG did not go, but he's now an unrestricted free agent. I don't really know if you have anything on Estriel because that's kind of a weird scenario to be a free agent in general now after the LAG stuff, but with Accuracy, that's more of a bigger news. He's been released. Where do you see him ending up? Because it seems like he is getting to that point that it seems like time is running out on his career, and he's kind of in that Clayster kind of idea of is this the last time that we actually see him play? And I think that's a very valid question for Accuracy at this point.
I would not be surprised if Accuracy wasn't on a CDL roster next year, at least playing. I do think, again, known as the Iceman, very smart S&D player, would not be surprised to see him get a coaching job or be a GM, whether it's this year or just in the future. Whenever he decides to hang up the controller, I feel like that's a very sensible next step for him. It's just a question of whether it'll happen now or in a couple years or next year, whenever. So, I personally don't know what team would go after Accuracy at this point after the season he just had, and having guys like Attach and Clayster seemingly being available. Just me personally, if I was trying to build a team, I would much rather go after Clay or Attach before Accuracy. So that kind of puts him at a disadvantage. Already talking about, with Falcons and Heretics and some of these non-English teams, then potentially that's taking away spots from some of these other guys, and that's kind of where these veteran AR players it could be a quicker exit than some fans might want for some of their favorite longtime players. So will be interesting there. Yeah, on the Minnesota front though, Diamond Khan hasn't said anything, and I don't think Minnesota has tweeted anything, so that's kind of interesting to me. But obviously the big one is Linz. Makes a ton of sense if Minnesota decides to, want to try to build around him. Similar to Gwyn, obviously he wasn't the Rookie of the Year, but he showed some flashes this year. So in terms of Minnesota potentially not starting from scratch completely, they might hold on to Linz and try to build around him. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I was actually just looking because the next team, LAG, obviously Diamond Con and Estriel, they joined from LAG to Minnesota for the Esports World Cup, or G2 for the Esports World Cup. But Diamond Con, like you said, hadn't tweeted anything about his contract status, so maybe he is going to stick with Minnesota or G2 heading into the season. We'll have to see as things progress. But LAG, the team that he was a part of, Flames and Assault have both announced that they're unrestricted free agents. Obviously, Estriel also announced that he's an unrestricted free agent. So if Diamond Con, I don't believe this is the case, but as long as he's not tied to LAG, then they don't have anybody on their roster as far as I know. And there's always the question of, an existential question for LAG, whether they will actually be around tomorrow. The fact that they don't have anybody on their roster and the fact that they seem to be cleared of any contracts or any obligations, do you see this as kind of like the end for LAG, or do you expect another revival and that they're just going to keep moving on despite all of this stuff happening?
I mean, hey, based on these reports, it wouldn't surprise me at all if this is the final LAG that we finally have. But, kind of like you said there, it wouldn't surprise me too if they just miraculously at the last minute decide to run it back, seemingly. It's kind of how it felt like last year. Like, they were the last team to announce a roster, and then there was the whole drama of it seemed like they had the roster with ASIM and gunless, and then at the last minute they just completely went in a different direction with the roster that we saw competing for the majority of this year. So who really knows what's going on over there? Just seems like, if anything, by having almost everybody involved, I mean, even some of the coaches I'm pretty sure have announced their free agents. So it seems like LAG, at least from the outside looking in, has somewhat paved the way for them to clean house and make an exit, but we'll have to see if it's actually if that's actually what happens or not.
LAT nothing's really happened in a while. Of course, we talked about JCap moving to the East Coast, and then Afro was released on August 6th. Real quick, where do you think Afro is? Like, do you think he starts in Challengers next season? There's no way that he starts.
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking. He has to start in Challengers and really prove that he can be at a CDL level before he comes back.
One thing, just real quick, I'm trying to scroll. I don't know where it would have been, but I do believe there was some or was that Seattle I'm thinking about? I thought I saw something about Cobra to Minnesota just as like a talking thing, and I'm having. Oh no, there it is. Yeah, August 19th, CDL scrimmage. Cobra is expected to be joining the Minnesota Rocker. Didn't include that in the roster tracker, but that is potentially something to keep an eye on. I think Linz and Abuza and Cobra like played together last year, and not this past season, but the previous year in Challengers. So that's something to keep an eye on there.
Yeah. Not Seattle Surge, Vancouver Surge. They are kind of cleaning house a little bit as well. Illy, a little bit. They're at least some of the. I'll just say this. So not the Seattle Surge, but the Vancouver Surge. Illy, who obviously started the season really well. Then there were allegations, rumors of Adderall abuse or something along those lines. He gets benched for the rest of the season. He announces that he's a free agent. He announced that on August 25th. One of his replacements, Brezzy, who finally, thankfully, got his CDL debut this season, he announced that he's an unrestricted free agent. And Hook also announced that he is a free agent now this offseason. So that leaves us with 04. That leaves us with... why am I drawing a blank on Abuza? And I mean, they look like they actually are in a good spot. They do have like a good young core. Where do you think Seattle goes from? Where do you think Vancouver goes from here?
So that was what we had mentioned the same time we talked about Carolina needing to build around Gwen, at it felt like we were having, at least I raised both points for Seattle/Vancouver. Do you only build around Abuza, or do you keep Abuza and O4 and try to look for two? And it seems like based on these initial reports that, Abuza and O4 aren't going anywhere right now, and they could just be looking for two and keeping both of those guys around. I think that would be really interesting. It would, I was impressed by what I saw out of O4 this year. Definitely, thought Abuza played better towards the end of the year too. Once he got back on his main AR role versus what he was doing at the beginning of the year when they were trying to have him on a sub and whatnot. So I think O4 did enough to warrant being kept around. I do think though, if Vancouver is going to, like go all in per se and try to make a splash, there is still a possibility that, they could go after three guys, build a team around Abuza, and then they keep O4 on the bench as a substitute. Um, Obviously, I don't know how likely that is. Don't know the contract situations and whatnot. It would make sense if, Abuza was just on that 1+1, or sorry, well, Abuza should be two. There was some like controversy around people thinking Abuza was a free agent and then he wasn't or whatnot. Not sure how that all happened, but signing the rookie deal, it makes sense if they're on a 1+1 because that's what we've seen historically for a lot of these CDL contracts. It feels like. And that's what O4 should be on, is what I was trying to get on. So he signs a rookie deal, signed it midway through the season, so it would make sense if it was closer to the league minimum salary. And then Vancouver, it would just make sense, like financially and as a business, to re-sign him to somewhat closer to that salary that he was on, if not the same salary for this past season. And then you have him, if you want to start him right away with Abuza, you have that option too. But if you do want to go out and get three other guys, you have a really strong sub waiting in the wings. If you go out, get three guys, and stuff doesn't go your way at the start of the year, you got him waiting in the wings. So I think Vancouver has some interesting wiggle room here in Rostermania in terms of what they can do. It's just going to be a question of what they end up wanting to do.
Mm-hmm. In Vegas, so now the Vegas Falcons, not the Vegas Legion, but all of the Legion players are unrestricted free agents. Fame, Geo, Nero, and Attach all have announced that they're unrestricted free agents this offseason. Of course, Falcons is playing with the All-Saudi team. And then Ojani, who had been on the team earlier this season, he had announced before the Esports World Cup that he was dealing with a health problem and that he would not be going to Saudi Arabia. So, where do you think? Obviously, this is an interesting roster because Attach, I think, will be on a CDL team when the season starts. I would honestly expect Geo as well.
Yep.
And Nero was very good as well. So, there's a potential that all four of these players could be on a team at the beginning of the next season. But where do you see this going now that they all are potentially going their separate ways as unrestricted free agents?
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously Fame was more on LAG this past year, so he was just on Legion for the Esports World Cup. But I would expect, if I was trying to build a team, I think Attach is almost a no-brainer to try and get an opportunity on another team. I personally, Attach obviously has his intangibles that we've talked about many, many times on this podcast in terms of just his personality, what he brings in terms of creating content and his fandom and all that. From a skill level and what we saw this past year, I think Geo 100% deserves another shot on a CDL roster, and he would be one of those players. If I was one of these teams trying to build a squad, he would be someone I'd be trying to talk to. I really like Nero as a player. I'm not like 100% comfortable in saying I think he'll 100% be on a CDL team the start of next year. I think he definitely has the talent to be on a CDL team. That's unquestioned. It's just a fact, again, like with Falcons coming in and Miami being here, the number of spots available for these guys is smaller and dwindling. So it will be interesting to see if they get a spot. But I do think Attach and Geo should almost certainly Well, I mean, it's tough for even Geo because, like, he's only
Attach is a
got that.
guarantee, but not everybody else.
I mean, even saying attach is a guarantee is tough too, because like you have guys like Clay, and
I
like
think
if the spots are dwindling, like I don't know.
I would just say that if nothing else, Carolina or whoever replaces them, like he is undoubtedly like one of the 6 or 12 best ARs, and I think that he will get on a team even if he was like maybe the 16th or 17th best. So like I just think there's no
I think he
way
should. Yeah.
unless he is just like I can make more money doing other stuff, then I don't need to do this for like the minimum. But like if it's coming down to he's being offered minimum contracts and he's willing to take it, I think he 100% ends up on at least a team.
Yeah, I think he should be on a team. It's just the math in my head is, some people are going to be on the outside looking in, and it's going to be tough. But there's also like in situation like Clay mentioned in that clip that I kind of just briefly went over. Like Clay just got released from Carolina, so it's not like they're most likely not going to bring him back. So it's similar with like attach, and it's not the same situation, but like he's been released by Minnesota previously, right? So like even in a world where Minnesota now got rid of accuracy, do you see attach going back there? Like I could see them wanting
I
to
could see
work
it.
together, but then does attach want to go back there? I mean, if it's his only opportunity, he probably does, but I don't know. There is I think it'll be a lot clearer when we know what organizations are actually in the league,
Yeah,
because
that's
like
true.
you said, if some new teams come in, attach is a guy. I mean, we talked about this.
Easy.
Yeah, like he's one of those guys you put at the top of the list as somebody you want to build around if you're just entering
Yeah.
college, you're
I mean,
returning in the
that's why
case of
Clay
some of these
should be
players.
hoping for these new teams to come in as well
Yes,
because
definitely.
the name is attractive to a lot of the newer teams, and
Yep.
he and Attach could really benefit for something like that, and other players, but those two specifically come to mind. But yeah, we're gonna have to wait and see with Vegas and or well with Vegas, but with these former players, it's tough, and I like you said, really the math is not working out in their favor because we used to have 12 teams. Now there's 10 because you have two teams that are made up of fellow countrymen and they already have full rosters. But then there's even fewer than 10 because nobody's getting on Optic. There's probably not going to be a way to get on Phase. So that leaves 8. C9 has at least, at the very minimum, half of their roster already filled out with with the core that they've had. Like there's no reason to get rid of them, so like at the very least there's only 2 spots open on C9 and probably just one if I had to guess. A lot of these players are not good enough to get on a team like Toronto that would presumably have championship aspirations, so then you're looking at half the league, and then it really comes down to who has contracts that can actually be like transferable to their new team and all that good stuff. And even a team like 100 Thieves, like they seem like they have a good chunk of their roster already set out for the next season. So the only other team that we haven't really talked about was Miami. That the only thing that they announced was that they had signed Rancor for the next season. His name sounds familiar, but I have absolutely no real idea about him. So I couldn't give you a ton of a backstory. But Spanish guy. So they Miami called him the Spanish Damage Machine. I'm not 100% on that. The nickname is a little long, but I think
I
maybe
kind of
just
like it.
Damage Machine might be better. But they're bringing him in, and I'm glad that they're committing to it, committing to the All Spanish roster. It ended up working out, relatively well. Like they
Yeah.
made the playoffs, which was the biggest thing. What do you think about? Obviously, you're a official. You know Rencor intimately. You know everything about him. You
I
know his life
certainly
story.
Yeah, not too sure uh about Rancor, his history or anything like that. And for some reason, I thought I lost internet because I can't get on COD Gamepedia, and even I just checked ESPN too, and something's going on with my internet right now. So I'm not gonna sit here in case I lose it. But Yeah, I don't know much about Rancor. I think the most interesting aspect of this Miami team is what they're going to do with the current guys they have. I think we mentioned it when we were talking about like Gwyn and Abuza and all that last time, but it seems like, Miami really hit their stride once they brought in uh Real in the second half of the season, and it wasn't immediate success, but they eventually built some good chemistry with him, and once he got really going, it felt like um, Miami was at its best. So I am expecting Real and if they are signing Rencor to be a starter, it makes sense with Rencor and Real, and then you have two spots there remaining between Metals, Lucky, and Vickle. So it would be interesting to see what they do there. Um, but yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, we saw Miami enter last year with a 5-man roster, and the initial reports were that Eric Boom was going to be a starter and Journey wasn't going to be a starter. And then we get into the league or closer to the league starting, and it was like, no, we never said that. Actually, Journey's the starter. Eric Boom's on the bench. Then they bring in Eric Boom very briefly. Didn't work out. And they bench Journey. And they bench Eric Boom, who's now been released. And then they get to Real. So we've seen Miami already in just their heretics, I should say, in its limited CDL time now. Having this 5-man roster and being willing to, you know, plug and play, for lack of a better term, from the bench and whatnot. So, um, possible those 5 guys, Vickle, Lucky, Metals, Rencor, and Real is just the 5-man we'll have, and then we'll see once the game drops what lineup they decide to be their starting for. But yeah, don't know much about Rencor himself. We'll have to wait and see.
And before you lose internet, let me give you the floor for a brief summation of what you believe the beta, your impressions of it. Obviously, Black Ops 6 beta was this weekend, and a lot of people. I saw some varying opinions, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. What do you think of the beta, briefly, so we don't have to redo this in 5 minutes?
Yeah, no, I've played it a little bit on um Friday now. Days are flying by. Played it did a little bit Friday, a little bit Saturday, and I enjoyed it for the most part. The Jackal PDW, the PDW name just reminds me of Black Ops 2. But the Jackal PDW has been that sub that it just seems like it's really good right now in the beta. So that's really uh, what I was using for the majority of the time. I feel like I've seen most people using that almost exclusively. So that's been a lot of fun. Seems like it's a really good gun at this point. Wouldn't be surprised if it goes untouched, if that's the meta SMG. But it's obviously very early. Treyarch could decide to nerf it before official launch, or they could be more willing to make weapon changes um, before the game actually drops or immediately after it drops. Only played a couple of the maps. There was the one map, I already forget the name, but it's one with like a big giant satellite dish, and a lot of people don't seem to like that one. There's a smaller one that's like got trains and rocks on the sides and stuff, and that one was all right. It was very fast paced. Um, and I'm already forgetting the third. Oh, the third map I played on is the one that people are like using the new Omni movement to jump in the pool and stuff. That's probably my favorite map so far of the beta. I haven't gotten to play the new ones that were just added, so maybe I'll do that later tonight. But yeah, very early impression so far of the beta. Definitely, it felt like a Treyarch game. I mean, even from like the numbers popping up after you get a kill of it being like plus 100, plus 150 or whatever. Just it looked like a Treyarch game. Felt like a Treyarch game. I haven't messed around with the Omni movement as much as some of these other guys, obviously. Were some weird situations of people like, diving backwards and stuff against, it's just like, like registering it in my head as I'm trying to shoot them was like felt a little weird. But I haven't messed around with it much, but it's obviously a part of the game, and we'll have to see how that aspect develops as guys like Shotzi and Hydra and all them get it and are learning how to abuse it and whatnot. But yeah, early impressions gets a thumbs up from me. Probably the most fun I've had playing COD in a while, even if it's just a beta. But again, early days, so we'll have to see where it goes from here.
And that's where we'll leave it. We will be back not next week, but maybe in 2 weeks. Also, like as always with off-season pods, it's kind of up in the air. But if you want to know when we're going live or when we upload a podcast episode, you can follow the Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. And you can follow or like the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. We're pretty much everywhere. So as long as you subscribe to one of those platforms, you should be notified when we upload a new episode. But we will be back in probably a few weeks at this point, and hopefully we'll have quite a bit to talk about in terms of ROSTERMANIA stuff, maybe some clarification on which organizations are actually going to even be a part of the CDL. That would be nice to hear, but we'll have to see. You can follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, and podcasters at Ego Chall Podcast. And Bink, take it away.
Yep, I still can't load any other tab, so I'm not going to risk it. Thank you guys as always for all the support. And we'll see you whenever we go live next time. So thank you as always, and remember to send the chow.